An environmentalist typically looks like an older white guy with glasses and crazy hair out in the woods by himself looking at wildlife. So someone who lives in the city can't be an environmentalist. Someone who grew up poor can't be an environmentalist. Someone who's a minority can't be an environmentalist.
So I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the inner city part of Philadelphia. There wasn't a whole lot of really natural space. And I also grew up in a low-income neighborhood. I grew up without access to a lot of the resources that people maybe would have if they had the money to expose themselves or expose their kids to different careers in the natural sciences. So I was thinking about veterinary medicine, right? What I've learned is that when you're a young person considering careers in the future, considering careers, especially when it comes to nature-based or natural science careers, it can be helpful to see what other people's paths have looked like, but also to wrap in my perspective that I have brought to the table as a Black woman and as a woman from the city, from a low-income background. So with that, I'll go ahead and jump right in. So I want to start with this note that I wrote to myself when I was about 4 years old. I had this little notebook that I would journal in, and I said, this is pretty illegible, so I'll read it to you. This is what I want to do when I grow up. I want to be an astronaut and a scientist, and I want to be a scientist on bugs and animals. The astronaut part we can forget about, because the moment I realized I couldn't get on a roller coaster, I knew I couldn't be an astronaut. But when it comes to science, that interest in wildlife and that interest in the outdoors and in nature and in science in general was there from a very young age. And so immediately, from the time I was able to get my hands on resources, I started watching all kinds of science shows, reading all kinds of science books. And these were some of the really awesome science communicators that I was able to be exposed to. So Bill Nye the Science Guy, the Mythbusters, the Crocodile Hunters, and Boomafoo, which was a huge favorite. And then I don't know if any of you will get this reference. It's from Futurama, so maybe too old for you all. But the problem with that, despite the fact that all of these people are phenomenal science communicators, phenomenal scientists, I didn't see myself. So even though they were able to get me really excited about science and get me really interested in the information they were talking about, I did not see a reflection of myself in that field.
So there was not a lot of green space at all in Philadelphia where I grew up, but there was a side of my house. So there was, my house was made of brick, and on the side of my house there would be slugs. And I would always go to the same spot every day to look at the slugs. And that's all the wildlife that I could identify and recognize, in a 3-block radius, but I would go outside and check on the slugs every day. And that was kind of like my one piece of nature that I could reliably go back to and monitor and, watch changes and, watch populations grow and shrink based on temperature, based on time of day, based on weather.
But then I had a really lucky encounter. This may look like a stock photo of man with guitar, but this is actually a man named Mr. Mark from my church back home. And he approached me and he said, hey, I heard that you really like animals. Well, my sister works at the zoo. Here's her number. You should call her. When he told me that, I didn't really believe that his sister could help me, his sister who works at the zoo, because I had never heard of a Black wildlife professional. And everyone who I knew who was Black who worked at the zoo typically worked in other departments like concessions or guest services. I had never seen, which is perfectly fine, but I'd never seen a Black wildlife professional. And so with my teenage angst, I had an attitude. I was like, she's not going to be able to help me. And I even called her and had an attitude on the voicemail. I was a horrible 17-year-old. But that was rooted in the fact that I'd never seen a Black person do that.
I had never been to the zoo in my life before I was 18. And so I did an internship in education at the zoo, and I realized how ridiculously passionate I was. And I didn't know that until I was taught. So I went to college, and I was a zoo and wildlife biology major at Malone University. I had never seen a blue jay until I took ornithology in college, and that's a common bird, and now they're my favorite bird here in North America.
We have the turkey vulture like Fester, and the black vulture, which is a little bit smaller, has a characteristic black head, but Fester is going to be doing some flight, so I'm going to ask that everyone in the audience stay nice and seated as he flies around. These are very large birds. They can have wingspans up to around 5.5 to 6 feet wide, and very broad wings as well. And that allows them to soar. And so they'll be soaring high in the sky, smelling for their next meal. And they have a really strong sense of smell. As Fester flies over you, you'll notice he has what appears to be a very large hole in his face. So they are very well built for being the garbage birds of our local environment. So let's go ahead and give it up for Fester and vultures everywhere. Thank you so much, Fester.
And so what I brought to the table, my Blackness, being a Black woman, and my background, where I was from, my socioeconomic status, gave me a perspective that I didn't see represented in my field. I was able to see and recognize and call out the inequities that other people weren't paying much attention to because they were not part of the communities that experienced those inequities. So the inequities that I noticed were, one, when it comes to the science field, and which I mentioned previously in this presentation, was that there is not equal access to these careers, right? So if you're from a low-income background, you may not be able to even go to the zoo to figure out what careers exist in wildlife conservation. And oftentimes to get prepared to enter this field, you have to do a lot of free internships, a lot of working for free. And if you're from a low income background, you usually can't afford to do that. On top of that, the lack of representation, children not seeing people like them represented in a field tells them that it's not for them. You know, I never thought consciously to myself as a child, you know what? I'm a Black woman, I'm a Black girl, and I only ever see white men doing this job, so I can't do it. That was never a conscious thought in my mind. I didn't even realize that my mind had been structured to think that way until I was told to call the Black woman who worked at the zoo, and my first thought was, she can't help me. That's when I realized how much these two elements create essentially an exclusion of people, especially people of color and people from low-income backgrounds, in the field of wildlife science.
Oh my, what is happening? Abby, tell me what's happening. Do you see all this meat coming out of this? Oh my word. All right, Wilbur, where you at? Just you. Hi, bud. Okay. All right. So this, everyone, is Wilbur. Go ahead, Wilbur. He's a Palawan Binturong. And I'm going to have you come down here and be on this side of me. Oh my gosh. You come right out. These are, like I said, found in the rainforests of Asia. But when Wilbur is eating fruits and veggies that have seeds in them, as he's eating, as you can see, he's a pretty messy eater. As you found out, food is dropping out of his mouth when he eats.
It's amazing that we can worship God in different ways and see different things that God has created. So I challenge each and every one of you all, get out to nature, go out and see some different things. There's some awesome things in the world that you can see, not just in Tennessee, but just in the whole wide world.